All right, hello everyone. I'm Thomas and welcome to my channel. I do educational videos on different obscure esoteric subjects, and we kind of did a couple different versions of the Tree of Life, and now we're doing the reciprocal system of theory. I think this is about the 11th video I've done on that. The first 7 or so were autobiographical or biographical. And now we're getting into the deductive development of the reciprocal system. The reciprocal system was founded or discovered by Dewey B. Larson back in the middle part of the 20th century. And it is a system where he starts with just a couple different postulates, and then he derives an entire universe from those postulates. And we are, this is the third day, I think, of working with these postulates, or maybe the fourth. And we're at number 22. So if you are kind of lost, you probably would need to go back and start at the beginning, start at A, the deductive development A, because this is going to be the deductive development D. So starting at number 22, there is no inherent relation between the time magnitudes involved in the different dimensions of the photon motion. One is the time of the progression of the natural reference system. The other is independent of this progression. Thus, the frequency of the radiation, the number of cycles per unit of the linear progression, can take any value, subject only to the capability of the process whereby the radiation is produced. Number 23. The postulate that the universe is three-dimensional means that 3 independent magnitudes are required for a complete definition of each of its basic quantities. Thus, 3 dimensions of scalar motion are possible. In order to distinguish these purely mathematical dimensions of motion from the dimensions of space, which are geometrical as well as mathematical in the context of the spatial reference system, we will refer to them as scalar dimensions. Okay, now he's basically saying here that space and time are reciprocals of each other and they're the same, but from our vantage point, our spatial reference system, we see space as both geometrical and mathematical, but we see time only as mathematical. There is no space of time. There is no geometry of this time aspect that we are capable of plugging into. Okay, and so he's making a distinction here between scalar dimensions and vectorial dimensions. The vectorial dimensions we're familiar with; those are the x, y, z coordinates, and but the scalar dimensions are mathematical. They refer to a magnitude but no direction. Only one okay, this is number 24. Only one dimension of motion can be represented in a 3-dimensional spatial system of reference. Each motion shown in such a system is represented by a vector, a one-dimensional quantity having both magnitude and direction. And any combinations of such motions can be represented by the vector sum, which is likewise one-dimensional. A scalar motion has magnitude only and no inherent spatial direction. It therefore has to be given a direction in order to be represented in a spatial reference system. Number 26. To give directions to the members of a system of scalar motions, it is necessary to couple one of the moving locations of the stationary reference system in such a way that it is represented as motionless. The directions imputed to the other motions of the system are then determined by their relation to this assumed motionless reference point. So he's saying that if, in order to put something into a reference system, you have to, at some point, say this is the reference point and this point is motionless. And then you can derive all of the other relations from that motionless reference point. But that's not part of a scalar, any type of scalar system. In the scalar system, everything is moving, so there is no reference point. In order to make these kind of geometrical representations, you have to first basically assume and delineate a reference point and assume that it is stationary. Okay, so I'm just going to read that one again. To give directions to the members of a stationary of a system of scalar motions, it is necessary to couple one of the moving locations to the stationary reference system in such a way that is represented as motionless. The directions imputed to the other motions of the system are then determined by their relation to this assumed motionless reference point. For example, if we designate our galaxy as A, the direction of the motion of distant galaxy X, as we see it, is AX. But observers in a galaxy B see galaxy X as moving in a very different direction, BX, because they use a different reference point. This contrasts sharply with the directions of motions of our ordinary experience, vectorial motions, which are the same regardless of the location from which they are being observed. In this vectorial case, the direction is the property of the motion. Okay, so he's really pointing out here the major differences between a scalar reference system, a scalar dimension, and a vectorial dimension, and that this scalar system is something that is basically foreign to us. Okay, now this is number 27. From the 25 and 26, the ones that we just did, it follows that the factors which determine the direction of a scalar motion are independent of those which determine the magnitude. The direction is a result of the nature and location of the coupling of the motion to the reference system. It may be a constant direction, as in the outward travel of the photons of radiation, or it may be a rotationally distributed motion, one that is constantly changing. Okay, and then now 28 is from 27. The translational motion of a photon, instead of being unidirectional, as in number 18 above, may be rotationally distributed in the reference system. The motion thus distributed, which we will call a scalar rotation, is a linear motion with a constant magnitude, but a continually changing direction. Now, here, Mr. Perret has a footnote, and he says, Larson bases his work on linear velocity and does not recognize the concept of angular velocity as a primary motion. In the reciprocal system 2 research that Perret is involved in or was involved in, both are considered primary. The yin angular and the yang linear aspects of motion. Consider that in a vacuum where no other forces are present, you can throw a baseball with linear velocity or spin it in place with an angular velocity. Both will retain their velocity forever and are therefore primary motions. Okay, now this is kind of important here. So Larson considers rotational motion to be kind of subservient or secondary to this linear motion. He's saying that this linear motion is the primary motion, and then this rotational motion kind of requires the linear motion before the rotational motion, and so that it's not primary. It's what does he say? He says it is the motion thus distributed, which will be called a scalar rotation, is a linear progression with a constant magnitude but a continually changing direction. But for Perret and the reciprocal system 2, it's a yin-yang type of thing. And the yin is angular motion, around 360 degrees, whereas a yang motion is a linear motion. So he says that both of those motions are primary, and he uses this case of a baseball to demonstrate that. And really, if you put a baseball in a vacuum where there are no effects of friction, and so if you push the motion in one direction, it will keep moving in that direction forever. If it's not stopped by gravity. But in the same way, if you spin a baseball around and around and around, it will keep going around and around and around forever as well. So to me, that argues against Larson and for Perret. The fact that both of those motions will continue on forever means, to me at least, or infers that they are of the same station. One is not primary and one is not secondary. They both have the same status. So both rotational motion and linear motion appear to me to have the same status, but to Larson they don't. The rotational motion is secondary to the linear motion. Okay, now number 29. From number 23, scalar rotation can take place coincidentally in 3 dimensions. From number 24, however, it can be represented in a spatial reference system only on a 1-dimensional basis. The magnitudes of the motions in the 3 dimensions are additive and can be represented as a total, but the directions of the different distributions cannot be combined. The representation in the reference system therefore indicates the correct magnitude or speed of the 3-dimensional motion, but shows only the directions applicable to the single dimension of the motion that is parallel to the dimension of the reference system. Okay, so now you're probably starting to get and see how Larson's writing, or even his speaking, because this is a transcript of a talk he gave, it's so hard to follow because he's using, I don't even know how many prepositional phrases he uses here. It can be represented in a spatial reference system only on a 1-dimensional basis. The magnitudes of the motions in the three dimensions are additive and can be represented as a total, but the directions of the different distributions cannot be combined. He's basically just saying that you can't combine scalar motions and vectorial motions. You can't add them together. The scalar motions are a magnitude. The representation in the reference system therefore indicates the correct magnitude or speed of the three-dimensional motion, but shows only the directions applicable to the single dimension of the motion that is parallel to the dimension of the reference system. Number 30, in the absence of any specific restrictive factor, rotationally distributed scalar motions are distributed over all spatial directions. The magnitude of such a motion toward a point in any given direction is therefore inversely proportional to the second power of the intervening distance. This is the origin of the inverse square law of gravity. So, if you have gravity, gravity follows an inverse square law. It's kind of amazing. Larson doesn't even refer to he just says this is the origin of the inverse square law. Doesn't say the inverse square law of gravity or anything, and so that's why Larson is so difficult to read, and that's why nobody has ever really gotten Larson, is because of his, it's not obfuscation. It's just that he's not a teacher. He writes well, but he does not teach. He does not I've had, when I took calculus in college, I had, I think it was my second semester, and I really did poorly in that class. But I had this teacher who was like the world's expert on this one aspect of calculus. But I guess she was just so brilliant in this one aspect that she just assumed that everybody else was like as brilliant as she was, and she just couldn't explain anything to the class. She would stand in front of the lecture hall and just write proofs on the board, explaining why this thing, proving why this is true. And I'm just sitting there, I'm just like, look, I'll take your word for it that it's true. Please explain to me what it means. Don't prove it to me. Show me what it means before you prove it to me. She's talking on a level that's higher than what I was capable of grasping. And Larson does a lot of that too. And my purposes here are to show you kind of the way that Larson thinks and that way he goes about things, and then maybe try to clarify some of his stuff, but also to be able to show why this is nobody has really picked up on this. And also that Bruce Perret does a much better job of explaining things. Not perfect, but much better. I mean, you can't really get on Larson for it because he has such a difficult job to do. It's so difficult to be explaining this to any type of audiences, what he's come up with. But anyway, he's saying this is the origin of the inverse square law. That's gravitation. So like if you've got these two things that are 12 inches apart, they exert a force of 1 on each other. But then if you make them twice as far apart, so now they're 24 inches apart, they exert only 1/4 of that force. Not 1/2, but 1/4. A square. It's a square. And then so if you move it 36 inches apart, the force is not 1/3 of the original force, it's 1/9 of the original force. So it's a square. If you move them to only 6 inches apart, half the distance, the force is not twice as much, but it is 4 times as much. If you move it 1/3 the distance, the force is not 3 times as much, it's 9 times as much. Okay, so that's the inverse square law. You have to square the coefficient there. Okay, number 31. Inasmuch as the natural reference system progresses outward at unit speed relative to the spatial reference system, no further increment of outward speed is possible because of the discrete unit postulate. The net total magnitude of a rotationally distributed linear motion must therefore be inward. Okay, now, again, remember the discrete unit postulate. Everything is in units, integers. You know, you either have 0, you have 1, you have 2, but you don't have 0.38 or something like that. Okay, this will be the last one here. If the scalar motion is less than 3-dimensional, the basic photon will move outward as radiation in a vacant dimension, and the motion combination will disintegrate. In order to be stable, the rotationally distributed motion must therefore be 3-dimensional. Okay, this rotationally distributed scalar motion he's talking about is gravity. And so he's setting up the conditions for gravity. You have to have 3 dimensions of this inward motion, this rotationally distributed motion, in order for something to be stable, like matter. So gravity is what he's using as the vehicle to create matter. But we'll get on with that next time. That was number 32. We'll probably start with that tomorrow. Meanwhile, have a great day. We hope to see you soon, and stay tuned for future videos.